Hello and welcome to Game 2 of the 2021 World Chess Championship. My name is Nathan and this is MTX Chess. Alright everyone, welcome to our analysis of Game 2. Today, Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces and Jan Nepomniachtchi with the black pieces. We will just jump right in. The goal of this video is really to go through the game, show you the key moments of the game, show you some interesting lines, but by no means to give kind of a thorough tactical treatment of all the different positions, because as you'll see, this was a very complicated game and an exciting one. So Magnus starts off with d4 after knight f6. We have c4, e6, knight f3, d5, and after g6. And sorry, the arrow is showing some of the computer moves here. What we're getting into right now is a Catalan for white. So this is the closed Catalan, which is a very popular opening among grandmasters. You can see we kind of started out with what looked like it was going to be kind of a Nimzo Indian with the knight f3, and here we've transposed into a Catalan where white puts their bishop on this long diagonal. They're just fine with black capturing this pawn because it's the positional advantage of the bishop is worth compensation of the pawn, and the idea is that white will be able to win this pawn back. After castle kingside, we have d takes c and queen c2. So obviously, like we just talked about, white's going to win this pawn back. And this next move is really the first surprising move of the game, and that was Nepo playing b5. So why is this surprising? It kind of makes sense that you would want to hold on to the pawn, so why would that not be the most common move? Well, the most common move in this position is actually a6. And the reason why is because if black were to try and hold on to this pawn like Nepomniachtchi does in this game, they get really stunted development. The amount of tempos that they have to spend shoring up this pawn are all tempos that they cannot spend developing their knight, developing their bishop. And for that reason, a lot of grandmasters elect to just give this pawn up. They don't think that holding on to the pawn is worth the detriment of not being able to develop their queenside. So we'll see in this game how Nepomniachtchi defends this pawn and how he very slowly develops his queenside pieces. So after b5, I think it was a little bit of a surprise to Magnus. Magnus continues with knight e5. It looks like this pawn is hanging, but remember that this bishop really becomes a monster in these Catalan lines, and so this knight move is actually a discovered attack on the rook here on a8. Black's basically forced to play c6 to block off that diagonal. White plays a4 to weaken the pawn structure here. And how do you defend against this? Let's say black tried to play a move like a6. This would just not be a good move, because after a takes b, no, let's just play it. Which pawn do you capture back with? Obviously, the a pawn is pinned to the rook. The c pawn is pinned to the rook, and so, excuse me, the c pawn is pinned to the rook, and so there's really no way black can capture this pawn back. So a6 wouldn't work in this position. So somehow black has to kind of shore up this diagonal to make this white's light square bishop a little less powerful. And black does that with knight d5. Here, white plays knight c3. The computer considers this an inaccuracy. I'll be honest, I don't find this to be that bad of a move. The computer recommends a line, whereas instead of playing knight c3, white might play a takes b, c takes b, and now white can play knight c3 with a pin. Now that this knight is really pinned to the rook, it makes this bishop a little bit more powerful. And the way the computer said the continuation could work is after f6, white could play queen e4, really piling up on that knight, and after knight b6, could move the knight to safety. So kind of a long computer line. I know this looks strange because you don't, what about a fork coming here? But the computer has some kind of a very interesting line here, and not really a human line. I think knight c3 is really a very straightforward developing move that makes a lot of logical sense. And in this position, you can see already that we just have a lot of complex ideas at play. So obviously, there's always the possibility of the knight exchange. There's the possibility of the knight coming to b4 and putting pressure on the queen. There's the possibility of this e-pawn advancing, weakening this d3 square with the black knight eventually coming to that square. There's possibilities even of black pushing b4 and putting pressure on this knight. So a very complicated position, and you got to understand that within all those moves, black also has to keep an eye out that this diagonal doesn't open up and that this file doesn't open up. So very complex, tactically complex already pretty early in the game. Black played the very logical f6 to push this knight off the square, gain some space. The knight can come to g4 or f3. It's kind of awkwardly placed on g4, so Magnus chose knight f3. And after queen d7, defensive move that really shores up these pawns here, we have e4. The first real big push to the center since a lot of development has happened for white. This e4 move obviously is going to expand to the center, but in doing that, it weakens this d3 square. So Nepo is going to take advantage of that square, and after knight b4, queen e2, knight d3. Again, the computer doesn't like this move and calls it an inaccuracy. Just to show the computer line, they were kind of thinking the knight coming to a6, and then white would kind of be forced to break through in the center, and you could get an exciting line where the queens get traded off, and you may have a passed pawn here, or just a monster knight on that square. Either way, Nepo ends up establishing this really great knight, and you can't tell me that this is not a good move for black. I mean, you just look at this knight. This is like an octopus knight, and really you couldn't have a better placed knight. Magnus has to break through somehow. He had it for in this position either d5 or e5, and he chose to play e5. I think that's the best option, simply because this trying to keep this bishop's diagonal alive. Here, black plays bishop b7. So certainly an interesting move for black, just trying to develop his pieces. Remember at the beginning we talked about how difficult it was going to be for black to develop their queen side, given that they were trying to hold on to this pawn. You can see that this position is kind of indicative of that. E takes f6, bishop takes f6, Magnus with knight e4, and now Nepo is going to try and get their other knight involved, continue to develop on the queen side with knight a6. And here, Magnus plays knight e5, and so the computer, again, doesn't like this move. A better move probably would have been something like knight takes f6, and after g takes f6, it may be strange to think, oh, you're basically helping black bring more pawns towards the center, but the reality is that this c5 square is a very important square, and by moving, if we go back to the position that Magnus actually played, by moving knight e5, allowing a bishop exchange here, this pawn moves away from defending the c5 square, allowing the black knight to really become a monster. So that's why the computer calls that an inaccuracy. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. The c5 square gets weakened, Nepo takes advantage of that, and Nepo is about to have really some monster knights here. Magnus plays knight d6 himself and develops a kind of a monster knight himself, and this knight becomes very important later in the game. Knight b3 for Nepo. And here, the best thing for white to do in this position probably would have been to try and hold on to his bishop with something like bishop e3. So Magnus could have played bishop e3, and then after knight takes rook, rook takes knight, maybe some type of protective move for the bishop here, and then white would have this bishop e4 move, a really nice move, putting pressure here on the knight. If the exchange happens here, obviously white picks this pawn off, and white also has opportunities of queen a5 with lots of nice pressure right over on the black king side. So that would have probably been a better continuation for Magnus. At this point in the game, we are at about move 20, and the players were starting to get a little bit short on their time. Remember, classical chess, you get 2 hours for the first 40 moves, and once you get to move 40, you get another hour added to your clock. So these players are kind of playing a little bit quick up until move 40. So anyway, Magnus plays rook b1. We get some exchanges here, and basically after what I just showed you there, white is now down the exchange. So you can see white has 2 minor pieces and a rook, and black has 2 rooks and the bishop. So the computer here says that black is a little bit better, but it takes exact play to convert on even these small advantages. The reality is white's pieces are simply better. This knight is fantastic. This bishop's on a nice long diagonal, exerting pressure. This rook's going to have a nice open file on the d file. And even though black's up a pawn and up the exchange, it's a difficult position to convert. After rook b8, white plays rook d1, and Nepo played 2 moves in quick succession, and they say that errors often come in pairs, and I think this was an example of that. Nepo played bishop a8, and I think this surprised a lot of people. People weren't really understanding why this move was getting played, what was going on. There's interesting ideas like knight takes b5 with discovered attack on the queen. I think I'm not really sure what Nepo was thinking in this position, to be totally honest with you. The knight could even come back, the queen could come up. There's a lot of different things that could happen in this position, and a better move for Nepo would have been something like a6, just really shoring up this this b5 square, or even moving the queen to relieve the discovered attacks on the queen that white would have once the knight moves. So after bishop a8, white plays bishop e4, centralizing the bishop and putting some pressure on the king side. And like I said, arrows come in pairs, and then Nepo pushed this kind of really strange c3 move. So a better move would have been b takes a4, and then white would have had bishop takes h7 with some tactics on the king side. But instead, Nepo played c3, basically giving up a pawn here. And white played queen c2. And after g6, got to stop from the bishop and the queen loading up on h7. We have b takes c3. And again, bishop takes b takes a4. So a better move here would have been queen g7. And then after f4, g5, putting some pressure on the white king side. Queen b3, g takes f4, queen takes e6, king h8. Here, white's position is a little bit uncomfortable with things like the bishop kind of coming down this way, the rook obviously on this file, the pawn that's about to be a passed pawn, because obviously this pawn can't take because of the queen. So this favors black a little bit, I think. But instead of playing all of that, Nepo decided with b takes a4. This basically just gives the pawn back to the queen, so queen takes a4. And we've got a couple moves that were played in relatively quick succession, simply because time control was a concern for these guys. So rook fd8, rook a1, and a very interesting idea here. So basically what Magnus is thinking is, oh, if the queen comes to c4, this pawn becomes very weak. And let's just say a move like this was played. If the queen came to c4, now white is thinking of possibly sacrificing their rook so that the queen takes to kind of lull the queen away from this square right here, and then white could try and work for a draw on the here in the black king side. A very interesting line ensues after c5, which is what was played in the game. Queen c4, which was also played in the game. Remember, Magnus is kind of the idea is going for this e6 pawn. A very, very interesting line would have happened after rook b5. So here you could continue. Magnus could try and continue with the rook sack. For instance, if takes here, check, and the king's coming here, and this would just really end up in a draw for white. But the idea here is that if Magnus were to take, Nepo would have had bishop takes e4, and now white can't take the queen because we have black coming down to checkmate. So white would have had to have captured like this. And, this would obviously be losing for white. So interesting tactics there, kind of a fun position to analyze. After queen c4, Nepo did not play rook b6, baiting him into it. Instead, simply simplified the position with bishop takes e4. And after knight takes e4, we have king h8. King h8, obviously, because the knight is threatening coming to f6. And if the king were on g8, it would have been a pretty nasty fork there in the endgame. White plays knight d6. You may be wondering, why didn't the knight come to f6 with a threat on the queen? And the reason is because these pieces are very powerful, and putting this knight on a square that blocks their control of the d file is definitely kind of the best move. After rook b6 gets played, we have queen takes c5. There are a couple ideas here of the game kind of ending in a draw, maybe after the queen coming here, we're getting a queen exchange. But instead, black decides to double up the rooks. And so what do you do here as white? Obviously, you've got some weak light-colored squares here on the king side. If the queen's coming to any of these diagonals, can really put some pressure on the king. You don't want to get back rank mated. And so Magnus decides to play king g2. After a6, king h3. And this is just a great little move here for Magnus. Again, kind of getting out of dodge, not going to have any checks here. In this position right here, black could force a queen trade. And then the game would be looking very drawish. So white, trying to play for the win, plays the kind of the tricky to find, but I think good move, king h3. After rook c6, we got queen d4. And then black is going to play king g8, c4, queen c7, loading up on that c-pawn. And now we have queen g4. So obviously the rook cannot capture the c4 pawn now because the queen will capture e6. So for instance, rook takes Queen takes check, the king's got to move, and then the knight picks off the rook. Actually, you'd probably just take with the queen and try and exchange queens there in that position. So so in this position right here, white has the more active pieces. This rook is fantastic. This knight is fantastic. These pawns you can't really capture because of the tactic we just showed. This rook is showing up the file down here, and the king is going to get involved in the attack. The queen's involved in the attack, and there's maybe some maneuvering that the knight can do. And I think Nepo, this was a tough pill to swallow for Nepo, who was up a pawn in the opening, was up an exchange in the middle game, and basically decided, I think, to play for the draw. And he'd really been fighting for the draw ever since the bishop, after playing that bishop a8 move and then the dubious c3 move. I think he'd been fighting for the draw. So here, Nepo, I think, made the prudent decision to give back the exchange with rook takes d6 after pawn takes d6, queen takes d6, and c5. We have queen takes c5. So here we find ourselves in an endgame where after queen e6, king g7. This was move 40 of the game, so both players meant time control. They each got another hour added to their clock. I think Magnus was down to about 2 minutes, and Nepo was down to maybe 6 or 7 minutes. And both players got up and walked around a little bit, and it was clear that they're kind of going to dig in for what many thought were going to be a very complicated endgame. So after rook takes a6, white is up a pawn, but it's difficult to see how they convert. Rook f8, putting some pressure on this weak f2 square. f4, shoring up that weak square. Queen f5. We get queens off the board here. And so this right here is a kind of a classic drawn endgame. Yes, white has the extra pawn, but the reality is it's just super hard to break through on the king side, and black can play very defensively and really let white make a mistake. After rook a7 check, king g8, king g4, bishop e5, rook e7, rook a5, rook e5, rook a7, h4, king g7, h5. White's going to try and break through the pawn chain here, but black just has king h6. And after king h4, rook a1, what's going to end up happening is black's going to get all these checks in on the bottom rank here, and white's going to be dancing around dodging checks. After g4, rook h1 check, king g3, g takes h5, rook check, king g7. Now we have g5, and this is kind of a key position in the game, because what's happened is this f pawn has become very weak, and if white ever wants to push this f pawn, they're going to have a hard time doing it, simply because the rook is going to be able to check the king ad nauseum, and this pawn will eventually fall due to some type of skewer. So we have rook g3, king f2. The rook comes out. Another move Nepo could have played here is simply rook g4, and again putting pressure on that f pawn. And if the king came up to defend, we'll just play it. So putting pressure on the f pawn. If the king comes up to defend, the rook just comes back, and we get ourselves into kind of a repetition here, and this could end in a draw. But instead of doing any of that, Nepo decided to play rook a1, and that's fine. He can check the white king from the side. Rook h6, rook a4, king f3, rook a3 check, delivering checks from the side, king f2, rook a4, king f2, rook a4, and it was in this position on move 58 that the players agreed to a draw. If you just continue this, it just ends up being a draw by repetition anyway. Like I said, this f4 pawn is pretty weak. And so game 2 of the World Chess Championship ends in a draw. An exciting game. I mean, both games we've seen Magnus come out, give up a pawn in the opening for a positional advantage for the bishop pair. It just really goes to show you what a positional mastermind Magnus is, that he's willing and is comfortable giving up a full pawn in the opening for the positional advantage. But Nepo, hats off to him, has really played tremendously with some just incredible nerves of steel. Those knights he had in this game were fantastic. I think a couple errors shortly after that exchange, when he got up the exchange, allowed Magnus to come back into the position and equalize. I think had Nepo focused a little bit more maybe and not played those moves so quickly, perhaps black could have gotten a win. But even with excellent, even without those mistakes, it's difficult to edge Magnus out in a middle game with such a slight advantage. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Game 3 is tomorrow, so please come back and check out our channel for our analysis of Game 3. Let me know how I'm doing in the comments below. You can always play me on chess.com at the username MTXChessOfficial. I look forward to hearing from you guys. See you tomorrow. Bye.